Just Paint. Hi, and welcome to JustPaint 5. This is painting with a palette knife and a brush, mostly palette knife. Now what we're doing is applying just some simple colors to the top of the painting. This is going to be the substructure for the sky. Now we're just dropping in raw colors. I like the sunset effect, so we use a lot of reds and yellows to accomplish that. And we're using a palette knife that's about 1 inch long, and it also is just very, very narrow. And what we do is mix a bunch of terps together, and then we wash in our background. We have little drips here and there. We don't worry about any of that. The idea is you just want to get the paint on the canvas, and that's what we're trying to do. That is what the entire series is all about. You have to stop overthinking things. You got to let the right brain just do what it wants. Just let the brushes flow, let the paint flow, get it on the canvas. Don't worry about creating a masterpiece. Just paint. As simple as that. Now on the bottom we're adding some primary colors that will serve as our ground colors. So we have browns, we have greens, a little white just to wash it all in. Then once again, what we'll do the same thing as we did to the top. We'll use terps and we'll just push it into the background. This is just creating a very wet surface for us to work on. I work wet on wet all the time. And what that really means is that I'm applying wet paint over wet paint continuously. Now the main idea with the palette knife is that makes it relatively easy to do. You can see when you go into the sky, I start adding more white just to blend it out a little bit, and with the once again with the 1 inch palette knife, and it slides the paint over other paint very, very well. It picks up a bit of the background to pull it through the paint, plus you get paint that just comes primary and stays on top. Now the color values in the painting are not quite right. The lighting for the actual painting is done with overhead lights, and unfortunately they're fluorescent, so it has more of a tendency to wash out in the video. At the end of the video there will be the painting that's finished with the correct color shot and better light. So we just start working more and more colors into the top. For those of you that are looking for my website, the most common error that people do is they don't put the second R in Byron. It's B-R-Y-R-O-N, not B-Y-R-O-N. Now this finished painting, like all others that I do, is currently for sale on my website, and that's http://jamesbryronlove.com. We start working the colors in and start going after the effects that we can get with a palette knife. Now often I will use a palette knife like a brush and a brush like a palette knife. For me they're fairly interchangeable. Start doing our basic mountains. And we're using a brown paint to do that. Now, this will serve as the basic substructure for the mountains that we're putting in. Now, once again, these mountains are imaginary, but I have a lot of references to mountains in BC. I've seen thousands of mountains, so this becomes an interpretation of the things that I've seen. So these are just rough outlines that we're utilizing for the mountain shapes. We'll also bring it down so we get a little bit of the prairie in front of the mountains. Use a brown. Often we'll use a black and then work white into it for the snow caps, and that's because in the winter the mountains are mostly gray with white, but we're looking more for autumn in this one. So we're using a brown as a background, and we'll work black and white into it a little bit later. Darker color black actually helps to bring out the designs in the mountains, all the little extra areas, depths, shadows. Palette knife itself is ideal for this. When we start with the white, we loosely mix the white and we pull it down through the other colors. And that's the main advantage of working wet on wet. I work in mostly oils. However, this can also be done with acrylics. It's just a little bit more difficult because acrylics tend to dry a lot faster. In oils, it takes many, many days before they're even surface dry. So you have a lot of extra working time. You can do whatever you want, come back tomorrow and still work on the painting. It's not even an issue. So that's my preference for oils. You can paint with whatever you like. The main idea here is to actually get paint on the canvas. Quit thinking about it. Allow the right brain to do the things it needs to do to produce the images, the colors, the shapes, and the shadows, and everything else that is a painting. If you think about it too much, that means your left brain is trying to decide things for you. The left brain is not very good at art. So you basically do want to engage the right brain, and that'll give you your ability to create art. The same reason we do voiceovers for these videos is because while I'm painting, I have to remember to talk, and talking becomes more of an activity for the left brain, so there ends up being a little bit of confusion there. So it's easier just to shoot the video and then do a voiceover. What we're doing is adding more depth to the mountains, changing a few things, adding some extra colors, bringing out some of the highlights. Because this is a sunrise sunset scene, we're adding a lot of extra colors that may appear. So we're putting reds and yellows into the base of the mountains. We're also going to build a lake-like structure in pretty much the center of the painting. Add a little bit more brown for the front end of the mountains. This will help give us our depth, because we want more of a valley prairie scene into the front of the painting. Start adding our greens. I know it doesn't look very green on the video, but that's a very dark viridian type green. Brush just to move the colors around a little bit and give them some softness. You have to be really careful when you're mixing paint on top of paint not to overblend. Palette knife, a lot of times what I like to do is actually just take paint on the palette knife and tap it into the canvas, and this, when you pull back, you actually have color changes that happen in the paint because you're pulling back the original paint and now it's getting mixed in with the new paint that you're putting down. When we go to the brush, we're using a fan brush and we're using it somewhat like a palette knife, except that it has more and different edges. So what we're doing is putting a tree line in. And remember, this is an abstract realism, so you can tell that it's mountains, things like this. You have the general idea, but the colors are not really colors that you're going to find, as well as we use a lot of impressionism to achieve a particular look in the painting. Down to the bottom, we start adding extra trees and with slightly longer lines. Use the edge of the palette or the brush, and we just tap in a general tree shape. It's just more or less a line, and we'll add some highlighting and various other things to it a little bit later. Mostly what we want to do is fill up the color. So we're adding more and more color to the areas that are going to be more green. We'll add other things to the areas that are now currently brown. Usually use a yellow to help highlight and put color changes into the trees. It makes them stand out really nicely. Bear in mind, there's no correct way to use a palette knife. There's no correct way to use a brush. You have to do what's comfortable for you. You experiment and find out what works for you. There's a lot of tutorials on how to do things, but if that's not comfortable, then you have to decide and make your own way. We add a lot of reds and purples into the foreground just to bring the color up. We also like to add a little bit of white, and that helps us with toning down some of the colors, highlighting them. We're adding a variety of different colors down into the bottom, some lighter colors, some really light browns, and we're going to mix those in with a little bit of the reds as well. And the impressionism part is that it creates a different layer at the bottom of the painting. We add a little bit darker colors to mix in with there as well. Now, what this does completely is it creates an entire autumn style scene. So we have reds and yellows and greens and purples and all those colors that we find mostly in the autumn. But you'll see the difference in the colors when we do at the end of the video, you'll see a finished painting in more its true colors. Now it's just all the little final details that you're just going to work in with the brush. Remember the entire idea. Just paint. Don't worry about what things are going to look like. Just get the paint on the canvas. Adding a few extra highlights through our water area, and we should be just about done. You know when you're done, when you're satisfied that it looks the way you want it to look, or close enough to the way you want it to look. That's it. Thanks for watching. The finished painting.